All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll introduce myself again for folks who are just joining, but I'm Casey Swegman. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Tahirih Justice Center, and we're so excited to have you with us today. There's already a great group on, and I'm sure other folks will join us as we move through the presentation. And I'm really just here to give a very brief introduction and to hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Alex Goyette, who is really leading the public policy work on the state level around child marriage for the Tahirih Justice Center and has been doing that for quite some time now. Very briefly, I've been with the Tahirih Justice Center a little over 10 years now, and many of you might know me from my time in direct services and having moved up through that space at Tahirih to step into the Director of Public Policy a couple years ago. And the Tahirih Justice Center is really wearing a few hats in the public policy space. Of course, the bread and butter of what we do is immigration policy work, advocating on behalf of immigrant survivors of gender-based violence across the federal government, and our state-based policy work, which Alex will be walking us through later today, which focuses on forced and child marriage. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Alex and look forward to your questions and the conversation throughout the presentation today.
Thanks, Casey, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today in what really is a celebratory webinar. For those who haven't been following along closely, this year we had 3 more states end child marriage, including Michigan, which was the most recent one, and that brought us up to 10 states, hence the title of our webinar here today, 10 states later, ending child marriage in the US. As Casey mentioned, I'm Alex Goyette. I'm the Public Policy Manager with Tahirih. My work focuses almost entirely on our state level legislative campaigns, and especially those focused on ending child marriage across the US. And with that, I'm gonna just jump right in. So a quick introduction to Tahirih for those who don't know us as an organization. We offer a range of legal and social services to ensure that all of our clients can escape violence and rebuild their lives in safety. And those services take a lot of different forms. We have attorneys on staff who provide immigration, family, and civil law services, both in a direct service capacity, and then the civil law also takes on an impact litigation form for our public policy team. We also provide social services, and what we're here to talk about today, of course, is forced marriage protection. So my team is the Forced Marriage Initiative. We were created in 2011 to galvanize a national response to the problem of forced marriage in the United States. And the birth of our team, the FMI, as you'll hear me refer to it, really came in response to a 2011 survey that Tahirih conducted, where we asked direct service providers across the country, so shelters, people providing social services, et cetera, really 2 questions. First of all, were they seeing forced marriages in their caseloads? And second, did they feel equipped to handle those cases? And the answers that came back were broadly, yes, we're seeing these cases. No, we don't feel equipped to handle them. So Tahirih's response to that was launching the Forced Marriage Initiative. And our team takes a multifaceted approach to this issue. Obviously, today we're going to be mostly talking about the public policy approach, but we do also provide direct services to anyone in the United States or abroad, but with a tie to the United States who's facing forced marriage, and that applies to both adults and children, though we'll focus, of course, on children today. We also conduct research, both about how cases play out and about the legal and policy dynamics that enable these cases to happen. And we do a lot of outreach and awareness raising, so trainings for other policy advocates, trainings for survivor advocates, and trainings for direct services providers across the country. We really have a vision that the FMI shouldn't be the only organization that provides direct services to people facing forced marriage. That's already not the case. There are great organizations across the country, but we want it to be the case that someone facing forced marriage across the US can call their local shelter, and the staff in that shelter will know how to provide services in their case. So I think it's always helpful to start out with a definition. So I'll just answer the first question of what is a forced marriage. And the definition that we use is pretty simple. Forced marriage is any marriage where one or both parties either do not or cannot consent to the marriage. It typically involves elements of force, fraud, or coercion. And we also like to make clear that a forced marriage is not the same thing as an arranged marriage. So in arranged marriage, you might have families take the lead on identifying a partner or planning the wedding, things like that. But the ultimate decision about when, whether, and whom to marry still comes down to the individual parties to that marriage. Forced marriage is a form of gender-based violence in its own right. When a woman feels that she has no real choice when it comes to a marriage, she's losing a great deal of power and control over her own life. Beyond the harm of the forced marriage itself, though, it also intersects with other types of harms. Many of the cases we work on have elements that really make it similar to a human trafficking case. A lot of our cases involve stalking, domestic or family violence. Rape and sexual assault can be both what triggers a forced marriage to happen, and of course it can be the consequence of a forced marriage after it happens. And then when you're talking about the forced marriage of a child, there's obviously the question of child abuse in that case as well. So while forced marriages can happen to people of any age, what we're going to talk about specifically today is child marriage. And I think it's, again, always helpful to start out with a definition. So when I say child, a lot of images might come to mind, particularly of very young children. And while child marriage cases do sometimes involve very young children in the US, when I say a child today, what I'm talking about is the legal definition of a child, which is just someone who is under the age of majority. In the vast majority of states, the age of majority is 18. So once you turn 18, you are legally an adult. And before you turn 18, you are not an adult. There are a few exceptions to that. I believe there's 2 states that set it at 19 and 1 at 21. But broadly speaking, the age of adulthood is 18 across the US, and you'll hear me use that shorthand throughout the presentation today. So when the FMI staff are providing services to someone who's facing a forced marriage, those cases can always be complex. They can always be difficult and dangerous. But when the person that we're providing services for is a child, someone under age 18, the case is immediately gains another level of complexity and danger. There are particular challenges that a minor facing forced marriage is confronted with that isn't the case in the same way for an adult. The first and most obvious of these is that our legal system across the United States provides different legal rights to adults than it does to minors. So if you are 17 and 360 days old, you have a lot fewer rights than you will a week later after your 18th birthday. And that makes adulthood a really important distinction in these cases, because it's important for someone to have the legal rights of an adult in order to resist or leave an unwanted marriage. In addition to the actual lack of rights, there's often less of a knowledge of their own rights among children. Minors tend to have just less experience in the world by virtue of having been in the world for less time. And so it's more difficult for them to know what their rights are, even those limited rights that they do have. In many states, minors are not able to initiate a court action on their own behalf. They might have to have a protective adult. Typically, that would be someone's parents. It might be a guardian ad litem sometimes, but there's always an additional hurdle for minors in that case. And cases of forced child marriage may not be understood as falling within Child Protective Services mandates. And that's particularly the case for older minors, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, who are on the verge of sort of aging out of that child protective system, but who nevertheless still lack the legal rights of an adult. In many places, minors also have a limited legal ability to leave and maintain themselves outside of the home. In many states, the law would treat a minor who leaves home as a runaway, and the responsibility of a law enforcement officer who encounters that minor would be to contact the parents and then return them home. That obviously is a problem if you are a minor who's intentionally leaving your family home behind because you are trying to resist a forced marriage. There's also the issue that when law enforcement or CPS does get involved in a case like this, where the minor is probably living with the perpetrators of the forced marriage, which for children, the majority of the time, those perpetrators are their own parents and family, any intervention by law enforcement can have pretty serious repercussions for the child in the family home if they're not immediately removed. And so there's often hesitancy to report in the first place. And after reporting is done, if that case is not handled responsibly, there can be serious repercussions at home. And recognizing all of these challenges is why Tahirih has taken on the campaign to end child marriage in the US. Our entire organization is structured in a way so that our direct service staff and our public policy staff are always communicating with each other. And because of that, our direct service experience is what is directly shaping our public policy priorities. The FMI is no different. We're sort of a microcosm of that same dynamic. We have folks like myself on the team who are focused entirely on public policy. We also have other staff on the team who are focused entirely on direct services. We all sit down once a week for our team meetings where we talk about cases, talk about policy priorities. In addition to that, I share a wall with one of our direct service staff, the other one's across the hallway. So we're always in communication. And that dynamic is really what led to the campaign to end child marriage in the United States. We knew that given our experience working on these cases, the real way to solve the problem of forced child marriage is to cut it off at the source by raising minimum marriage ages to 18 and ending child marriage once and for all. So step one for any public policy campaign is to look at the status quo. What does child marriage look like in the United States? Thanks to research done by Tahirih and other organizations and reporters and researchers and academics across the country, we know a lot about child marriage in the US. We know that between 2000 and 2018, over 300,000 minors were married across the country. And while Tahirih doesn't necessarily equate every single case of child marriage with a forced marriage, we do know from data gathered across the country that the vast majority of these cases involve really concerning dynamics that point to possible abuse and coercion. For example, the vast majority of cases involve an underage girl marrying an adult man, and in many of these cases that male spouse is years or decades older. We've seen a lot of cases where the adult spouse might be twice the age of the minor that they're marrying. What we also know is that it's state laws that regulate the issue. That's really important. I think a question that's pretty common in this space is, why don't we just go to Congress and, set the age of marriage at 18 once and for all nationwide? And the answer basically is that constitutionally, we're not able to do that. These laws have to be done at the state level. And so that's why we're running a 50 state plus DC campaign instead of a single congressional campaign. And so while state laws do regulate this issue, they leave some really concerning gaps. For example, a number of states have exceptions that allow the fact of a child being pregnant to drop the age of marriage down below what it otherwise would have been. And in many cases, dropping that age of marriage down below the state's own age of consent to sex. So what should be a red flag for sexual abuse and a potential investigation is instead a reason to grant a marriage license. Many states also have parental consent exceptions, which allow essentially a parent to consent to a marriage on behalf of their own child. I can see how legislators would get to this as a potential safeguard. In the majority of cases, parents have their child's best interest at heart. But when you're talking about a forced child marriage, in the vast majority of these cases, it's the parents who are the perpetrators. And so parental consent exceptions are, in the end, really empowering those perpetrators to make decisions for their child. And finally, there are still today, and even more so back before this campaign started, several states in the United States that have no absolute minimum marriage age, meaning that if certain exceptions are met, if certain approvals are obtained, a child of any age could be legally married in those states. We also know a lot about the harms that are associated with child marriage in the United States. There's been a lot of academic research on this issue specific to the US. We know that women who married underage have higher dropout rates from school, hampering their education. We know they face increased medical and mental health problems across the course of their lifespan. They face increased vulnerability to violence, greater likelihood of future poverty. And we know that early marriage doubles down on the negative consequences of teen pregnancy. There's research into this specifically that shows for women who become pregnant underage, who give birth underage, the lifetime impact of that is not ameliorated by marriage. In fact, it's worsened. And so an underage mother who also weds underage faces more severe consequences from those dynamics than someone who stays unmarried until adulthood. We also know that the marriages themselves aren't typically successful. Marriages that start out when at least one party is underage have divorce rates of up to 80%, much higher than for the general population. So whatever a girl's starting point, we know that child marriage stacks the odds higher against her and increases the instability and insecurity she faces over the course of her life. So with all of that in mind, we know generally what child marriage looks like. We know the harms associated with it. I'm going to talk a little bit now about where we started. What did the laws across the United States look like in regard to child marriage before the national campaign to end child marriage kicked off? So when we launched this campaign, Tahirih knew that for our own sakes and for the sakes of other advocates and lawmakers, we needed to have a comprehensive picture of what these laws look like across the US. So in 2017, we published a first of its kind report. You see that pictured here, falling through the cracks, in which we looked at the laws across all 50 states and Washington, D.C., and examined how those laws enabled and or protected against forced child marriages. And a lot of laws did both, enabling, but also providing some limited safeguards. For every single state at this time, they set a sort of theoretical marriage age, typically at 18 or the age of adulthood. And these marriage ages basically meant that once you hit the age of adulthood, you can marry without having to seek any additional approvals. You don't need your parents' permission. You don't need a judge to sign off. You just, as an adult, you have the right to go get married. But at the same time, all of these states had exceptions to that. They had pathways for someone who was underage to be married. Some of the ways that these exceptions existed showed up, especially in parental consent exceptions. This was particularly often applied to older minors, 16 and 17-year-olds, and it basically allows a parent to consent to the marriage of their child. Again, as we know from our casework, as we know from the advocacy of survivors across the United States, when it's a child facing forced marriage, more often than not, it is the parents who are the perpetrator. And so parental consent is really enabling the most common perpetrators of forced child marriage. Many states also had pregnancy exceptions that took what should be a red flag for abuse, the fact that a child is pregnant, and instead made it a reason to grant a marriage license. Often that marriage license was being awarded to the child's abuser, granting them permanent access to that child. And finally, many states also had some sort of judicial approval process. This is especially the case then and still today for younger minors or for minors whose parents didn't consent to the marriage for whatever reason. So many states will say, like, if your parents don't consent, then you still have another route. You can get married with the judge's approval. And there always has been and is still today a really broad spectrum of how protective these judicial approval processes are. I think a lot of people hear, oh, well, the judge is looking at it and think that it must be a pretty protective process. But in reality, a lot of these so-called judicial approval processes were nothing more than a rubber stamp, often for parental consent. So while all states prior to this campaign were falling short, there were some limited acknowledgments in state statutes that child marriage can potentially be harmful and is something that needs to be restricted more so than adult marriage. And these protections, limited as they are, were implemented really in two different ways. They can be implemented by the court clerk or the county clerk, the person who is responsible in their day-to-day job for issuing marriage licenses, or they can be implemented in the judiciary system. So some examples of safeguards that clerks can implement are setting a firm minimum marriage age in statute. This is much more common today than it was before the campaign launched, but that's a pretty easy thing for a clerk to read. No one below age 16, no one below age 18, whatever, is allowed to be married. The person in front of me is 15. I will not issue a marriage license. An important component of this is requiring someone applying for a marriage license to show an official proof of age. This is still surprisingly not very common across state statutes. It's likely that a lot of clerks are doing this as a matter of course, but you really do want that to be written into statute for these cases. And then finally, some states have had residency requirements in place for minors. And so basically what that means is minors would only be allowed to obtain a marriage license in the county where they reside or in the state where they reside. Obviously, that's not helpful for someone who is being forced into a marriage in their own home, but it does at least prevent minors from being brought in from out of state in order to be married. There are also some states where the judicial review processes did have some limited safeguards built in. For example, some states required judges to have some sort of expertise in related fields, juvenile law, child abuse, etc., that at least means that the judge looking at this has some knowledge of the dynamics that might go into a forced child marriage case. Some states also required a formal hearing to be held. A few even appointed counsel to represent the minor's best interest or did background investigation. These more protective processes are still imperfect. They are not enough to completely end child marriage, and they were also, before this campaign launched, very few and far between. So I'm now going to go through and just give a quick rundown of what the legal landscape looked like back in 2015. That's the year before Tahirih launched the modern movement to end child marriage in the US with our campaign in Virginia, which happened in 2016. I'll start by looking at the simple top-line question of, back in 2015, how many states banned child marriage entirely? And the way you would do this is by just setting a minimum marriage age in your statute that matches up with the age of majority. So again, that's 18 in most states. I'm going to use 18 as shorthand here. Back in 2015, there were a whopping 0 states that did that. Not a single state in the United States had banned child marriage prior to 2015. The sort of next best option that we talk about at Tahirih, if you're not going to end child marriage entirely by setting your minimum marriage age at the age of majority, the least you can do is tie the ability to marry to the legal concept of adulthood. And in some states, you can do that by tying it to an emancipation process. And so what that is, it's a process by which a minor who's not reached the age of majority, so usually someone 16, 17 years old, can apply to a court to be basically granted an exception and granted the legal rights of an adult. And in some cases, one of those legal rights of an adult could be marriage. This is not as good as ending child marriage overall, but it does at least involve a court in the process, and it grants that child the legal rights of an adult, so they are entering that marriage on an equal legal playing field with an adult partner. Even at this second best level, back in 2015, there were exactly 0 states that did that. I promise this entire chart isn't going to be zeros, but that gives you an idea of where we were at. There was not a single state across the entire country that was taking the issue of forced child marriage seriously enough to realize that marriage needs to be something for adults. There were, however, some states that set firm age floors. So I talked a little bit about sort of theoretical age floors before, where they say 18 in big air quotes and then put a bunch of exceptions to that. There were a number of states that had an absolute minimum marriage age beneath which there were no exceptions. And so when I say age floor 17 here, I mean a 17-year-old might have been able to get an exception, usually through parental permission, but a 16-year-old in that state is completely unable to marry. So back in 2015, there were 2 states that set an age floor of 17, not allowing anyone younger than that to be married. 12 states set the age floor at 16, and then 9 states set it somewhere below 16. Typically, these were being set at 14, 15 years old. You'll notice the totals here are still far short of 50, and that, I guess, reveals my hand here that there were still a majority of states, 28 states, that had no absolute minimum marriage age in 2015. So in terms of what the exceptions look like that would allow a minor in these states to be married, I talked a bit about pregnancy exceptions before, and there were 10 states in 2015 that were allowing the fact of a child being pregnant to be a reason to lower their minimum marriage age. That's a full 20% of states. I also talked a little bit already about the issues with parental consent and how this is most commonly applied, at least to older minors. There were many states that applied it to younger minors as well, but it's particularly common when the statute is addressing 16 and 17-year-olds. So back in 2015, 41 states, nearly everywhere across the country, were allowing these older minors to be essentially to have their parents give consent on their behalf and allow them to be forced into marriage by their own parents. Now, a bit of a bright spot here, there were some states that required universal judicial approval. I've talked a little bit already about, like, this is not a perfect process. A lot of these processes maybe look like rubber stamps, but at least having a judge's eye on it, it shows that the state is taking the harms of child marriage somewhat more seriously than states that aren't involving judicial oversight at all. In 2015, there were only 8 states that required all minors to go before a judge. You know, not nothing, not great either. Unfortunately, among the states that did involve a judge, the majority of these were those sort of rubber stamp processes I talked about without real serious safeguards, real serious guardrails for what the judge needs to be looking for, or any real guidance on why a judge might deny a marriage petition of a minor, particularly if they're spotting things like abuse or criminal history. 29 of these judicial processes were really just rubber stamps. And finally, even in 2015, there were still 5 states that had different laws depending on the gender of the minor in question. And for all 5 of these states, they were allowing girls to get married younger and more easily than they were allowing boys to be married. So that's where we started. I'll talk a little bit now about the progress that's been made. Since 2016, we've had a total of 34 states pass some sort of legislation to limit or to end child marriage, which is fantastic. Again, we want to get that number to 50, and we want all those states to be ending child marriage, but 34 passing a law, at least acknowledging and addressing the issue, is still something that we're very proud of. I'll run through this map here and just sort of what you're seeing. So the green states here are all of the states that have tied the age of marriage to the age of adulthood. Those states that have a little black star, those are the 10 states that have ended child marriage entirely. They did this by setting a minimum marriage age of 18 without any exceptions. That is the standard that we're shooting for across the entire country. So 10 states down, 40 plus DC to go. The other green states here without the stars those are the states that said 18, but with an exception for emancipated minors. So tying marriage to the concept of sort of legal adulthood instead of the age of majority. That's our sort of our second best approach. The beige states on this map passed a variety of more incremental reforms. They did things like setting or raising minimum marriage ages, limiting the age differences between partners, creating or tightening up judicial approval processes, things like that. But they have passed, something. They've addressed the issue in some way. The gray and red states have not passed any reforms since 2016, although I'll note that several of these have at least introduced legislation. Some of these have come quite close to passing legislation. I'll call out Washington State in particular has a piece of legislation that will carry over to next year's session. So we're very excited and hopeful that Washington will end child marriage next year. But those gray and red states have not passed anything since 2016. The difference between the gray and red states is just where they set their age floors. Those gray states, they at least have an age floor of 16 or higher already. So that is, it's a good thing. Obviously, it's not enough. They need to do more, but they're a bit better off than the red states. The two red states without an exclamation point here, Kansas and Hawaii, they set an age floor below age 16. Both of those states still set it at 15. They're the last states left that are setting an age floor lower than age 16. And then the states with an exclamation point still have no age floor at all. You'll notice most of those are red. We also have California here in beige. That's because California, in my view, somewhat absurdly did pass a reform, but did not bother to set a minimum marriage age at the time. So I'll quickly run through these same charts just to give you a more concrete picture of what some of these, beige reforms looked like, the reforms that were limiting but not ending child marriage. As I mentioned, 10 states have ended child marriage entirely. That's fantastic. That's the gold standard we're shooting for. We want that number to be 50 plus DC. Moving on to the concept of legal adulthood, that total is 16 states. So that's inclusive of the 10 states that have ended child marriage entirely. And then there are 6 additional states that have tied marriage to the emancipation process. So only legal adults can marry in those states, but they're not limiting it to the age of majority. We've also seen age floors rising across the country, which is great. There are now 10 states setting an age floor of 17. The number of states setting the floor at 16 has doubled from 12 to 24. And the low age floor, as you saw, is dwindling across the country. There are only 2 states left that bother to set an age floor, but don't set it at 16 or higher. And the real collapse has been in states that are not setting age floors at all. That's collapsed from 28 down to just 5 states left today. And we're hopeful that those 5 states will get the memo soon and end child marriage. In terms of the exceptions that are in place, we've also seen a big reduction in the most dangerous exceptions and increases in the exceptions that are a bit more protective, while still, of course, falling short of the goal of ending child marriage. There are only 4 states left that still have a pregnancy exception. 26 states still allow older minors to marry with nothing more than parental consent. That's obviously, we not even down to less than half of states on that one, but coming down from 41 where we started is still something we're pretty proud of. The number of states requiring all minors to go before a judge is now up at 15. And I would take this number and kind of combine it with the 10 states that have ended child marriage entirely. And I'd say we're now at half of states, 25 states are taking this issue seriously. I think doing anything short of ending child marriage or at least having judicial review is fundamentally not taking the issue of forced child marriage seriously. So we're glad that at least half of states are looking at it as a true potential source of harm. At the same time, judicial review processes are also becoming stronger as states add more teeth to those processes. There are only 10 left that are really just a rubber stamp. And finally, there is only one solitary state that is still differing by gender. Because it's only one, I will name and shame them. That's the state of Mississippi. Still treats boys and girls differently in their statutes and makes it easier for girls to marry at younger ages than for boys. There was legislation introduced there, I believe, 2 years ago, but it didn't pass at that point. So we're hopeful that they'll make a renewed effort at that fairly soon.
Alex, I'm going to pause you really quick. If you can go back to that slide, we had a question just to clarify between what is the difference in universal judicial approval and judicial rubber stamp?
Yes, so universal judicial approval, what I'm talking about here is among the subset of 40 states that allow child marriage in some form. How many of those are making sure that every single minor needs to go talk to a judge in order to get approved? So there's no minors in that state that can just get parental consent exceptions, for example. there is a much larger universe of states that have a judicial review process that is not universal. So again, a lot of these states that are the 26 states that are allowing older minors, say 17-year-olds, to just get a parent to sign off, they may still have a judicial review process, but they're only applying it to younger minors, 16, 15, 14, what have you. And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying universal judicial review. And then again, among that larger universe of all states with some sort of judicial review process, whether or not it is universal, 10 of those are still really just a rubber stamp. All of the others have a bit more safeguards built in.
Thanks, Alex.
So there's been a lot of change, not enough, but a lot. I'll talk a little bit now about how we got here and how the National Campaign to End Child Marriage has taken shape over time. I think the easiest way to do that is with a timeline. I'll spare you going through the specifics of every single state listed here, but here I have all 34 states that have passed some sort of reform to limit or end child marriage. The states with little stars next to their names are the ones that get a pat on the back for ending child marriage entirely. You'll notice there are 10 of those. You also might notice that there are a few states here that are listed twice. Those states have taken multiple bites of the apple to limit child marriage or end child marriage incrementally over time. Places like New York, Utah, Connecticut are all listed twice here because they've taken multiple efforts at passing reforms. So just the broad outline of the campaign. As I mentioned, Tahirih launched the National Campaign to End Child Marriage in 2016 when we passed a law in Virginia that limited marriage to legal adults in that state. That was the sort of spark that initiated this modern wave of reforms. There are now, a lot of other organizations in addition to Tahirih, both local organizations, statewide, national, a lot of us working on this issue and kind of pushing in the same direction. And so that's really exciting. And you can see that reflected in the timeline here as the campaign grew over time. As much as I would like to clone myself and be the one organizing and running and putting the energy behind all of these campaigns, that's not the case. There are advocates and survivors that are really pushing these things forward in all of the states here. That said, Tahirih has had an impact on every campaign that you see listed here. While we're not in the business of flying our staff out to bill signings in every single state, as much as I would love that, they refuse to increase my travel budget to that degree. No state has passed a reform without legislators or advocates speaking to our staff or referencing our work and research. So I'll highlight and give a little more detail on a few key campaigns here that have shaped the national picture and the various roles that Tahirih has played in those campaigns. There are some states where we've initiated and led campaigns, building coalitions from the ground up, identifying sponsors, writing bills, and coordinating really the entire advocacy efforts. In other states, we've joined existing efforts led by in-state legislators, by survivors, by other advocates, providing our expertise, our materials, and helping guide the work that is already happening, basically just, filling them in with what we've learned in other states. And there are a few states where Tahirih's influence is only indirect. Those campaigns might be led by legislators or advocates who've seen reporting on campaigns that happened in the neighboring state, or spoken to colleagues or advocates that we trained or worked with, or simply, showed up at a bill hearing and then pulled out one of Tahirih's report and read from it for part of their testimony, which I've seen in a few places from people that I've never spoken to directly. And I'm always really excited when I see that. So overall, Tahirih's work sometimes is entirely behind the scenes. Other times it's more public. In some states, we're in the news, we're at the hearings. In other states, we're really just making calls, exchanging emails, or putting our reports online for advocates to find. So in the next segment, I'll go into a little more detail about how some of these key campaigns played out and Tahirih's role in each of them. I'm going to highlight really 4 states that I view as key for shaping the direction that the campaign has taken. Virginia, New York, Texas, and Delaware. And you'll see New York's highlighted here twice. I talked about a couple of states that have taken 2 bites of the apple. New York is one of those, and that's part of the reason I want to highlight them. So Virginia in 2016, this is the campaign that really kicked off the national movement to end child marriage. And it's Tahirih's first sort of foray into the world of state legislative campaigns, and particularly campaigns around minimum marriage age. So to give you an idea of what the law looked like before this campaign started, back in 2015, Virginia set no age floor. There was no minimum marriage age under which no one could be married. As long as someone was getting the required approvals, they could be married at any age in the state. For children under age 16, they required parental consent and the fact of a pregnancy. And so this is one of those states that had a dangerous pregnancy exception in place. And then for older minors, that pregnancy requirement fell away, and all that was required was parental consent. And so one thing to notice here is Virginia had no actual oversight. It was a simple matter of a parent showing up at the clerk's office, consenting to the marriage on behalf of their child, and that's enough. You get your marriage license. Because of these permissive laws, unsurprisingly, there were thousands of children who married in Virginia. 75 minors married in the state between 2000 and 2013. And the year before the new law was passed, so in 2015, there were 182 minors married. In terms of why Tahirih started the campaign in Virginia, the first part of that answer is simple. It's where our founding office sits. Our headquarters and our public policy team are based in Virginia. And so with that comes more knowledge of the landscape here. We have connections to the advocacy community in Virginia. We have direct service staff who are working in Virginia, working every day with shelters across the state, for example. And so we have some degree of knowledge and connection in Virginia that isn't true in states where Tahirih doesn't have an office. The other part of that, though, is a direct service experience that our FMI team had. So I talked a little bit already about how Tahirih's direct service expertise really informs our public policy work, and the Virginia campaign is a great example of that. So I'm going to call her Maria. That is a pseudonym, but I'll call her that to protect her privacy. She was an FMI client, and when she was 16 years old, she was brought to a Virginia courthouse in sweatpants and flip-flops, not a beautiful white dress. You know, this is someone who is clearly not interested in getting married that day. Despite obviously being disinterested, her parents consented to the marriage on her behalf, and so the clerk issued a license as the law required them to do. What happened next was even more surprising. They turned around from the clerk's counter, marriage license in hand, and there was an officiant there waiting who offered to conduct the marriage on the spot for $75. So Maria's dad handed the officiant $75. The wedding was conducted, and she walked out of that courthouse married. This was a real wake-up call for us, us just as Virginians, for us as direct service providers, and for us as public policy advocates. We knew in theory how weak these laws were and how easily a child could be forced into marriage. But having a client go through that in the state where our headquarters is located really pulled the wool back from over our eyes about just how dangerous the laws in Virginia, but also in many of these other states are. So in terms of how the campaign played out, I'll give everyone a quick reminder what Virginia looked like in 2016 for those who don't specifically remember the state legislative makeup for every state going back that far. At the time, Republicans controlled both houses of Virginia's legislature, and Virginia had a Democratic governor. So sort of split power in the state with Republicans controlling the legislature and Democrats holding the governor's office. Because of that, and this is a pattern that you see across all of the campaigns I talk about, it was really important to have bipartisan bill sponsors. Tahirih is a nonpartisan organization, and so that's, it's just part of our values, but it's also obviously very strategic, especially when you're talking about closely divided legislatures, and particularly when you're talking about an issue like child marriage that doesn't fall cleanly along partisan lines. In every state where we work, we have Democrats support our bills, and in most states we have Democrats vote against it, and same with Republicans. In every state we work, we get some Republican votes and we get some Republican votes against. And so it's really important to have bipartisan leaders in any state where we're working, because while we might lose votes from both parties, we need to be able to gain votes in the legislature from both parties as well. Some of the other key dynamics of the campaign here was, of course, that survivor experience and the survivor advocacy that we had, thanks to working on Maria's case. This is another really common dynamic that you're going to see play out across all of the campaigns that I talked about. As much as I'm talking about Tahirih's role, that's simply because I work here and I'm an expert in Tahirih's role, but I do want to make clear that it is survivor advocates across the United States who are leading the movement to end child marriage. That's true in Virginia, it's true in the other campaigns I'm going to talk about later today, and it's true in pretty much every state that was on that list. Another key element that supported the campaign in Virginia was the easy availability of statewide data. We were able to go directly to the Office of Vital Statistics and pull up exactly how many children had married in Virginia over the course of 13 years, I believe is what we pulled. That is something that we assumed would be easy later on in all states. Unfortunately, we found that to not be the case. Sometimes we have to put in very specific requests because the data is not online. Sometimes the data doesn't exist at all. There are still states in the US that are not collecting statewide data on child marriage at all. And then finally, something, again, I already talked a little bit about, a key element of this campaign was the fact that we are based in Virginia. And so we had a lot of connections within Virginia already to, pro bono firms, to other advocates, to direct service providers, to folks in the legislature, or at least who knew about how the legislature functioned, things like that. Challenges in this campaign, I think the obvious one is that this was the first campaign of its kind. And so it was a real trial by fire for trying to end child marriage. It was also an early foray into state legislative advocacy for Tahirih, and to some degree, all legislatures are the same, but to a much larger degree, every single one is different. And while Tahirih had a lot of experience working at the congressional level, that doesn't all translate directly to working in a state legislature, even one that borders the national capital. So we were very much sort of building the plane as we flew it in this case, and learning a lot about the issue, about how legislators and other advocates respond to it, and just about the mechanics of doing a state legislative advocacy campaign. The other aspect of this campaign that was really difficult, and this is something that carried through all of the early campaigns on this issue, was building awareness on the issue of child marriage. Child marriage in the United States was very much not a mainstream issue back in 2016. Virginia was the first state to take a stab at this issue in the modern wave of reform. So, while today I can go up to a legislator and say, like, hey, did you see all of the reporting on child marriage in the US? And did you see that 34 other states have passed a law addressing this issue? Virginia, that wasn't the case. There wasn't much reporting on it. We couldn't point to neighboring states that were addressing the issue. And so having to start those conversations with advocates and with legislators at square one is really a challenge. Those conversations, instead of jumping straight to, here's how we solve child marriage, we had to start with, child marriage is an issue in your state, and this is why it's a problem. So the 2016 campaign ended in a reform that made Virginia the first state to limit marriage to legal adults. And so Virginia was one of those states that I talked a bit about earlier that does not set the marriage age at the age of majority, but does tie it to the legal concept of adulthood by requiring a minor to go through a court process that legally emancipates them, granting them the rights of an adult, which includes the right to marriage. With that process in place, it's important to know what safeguards are built into it. You could, in theory, you could make emancipation a rubber stamp that isn't super protective of someone being forced into marriage, or you can put a lot of protections in place. And so the process in Virginia, it has a firm age floor at age 16. So 15-year-olds are not able to emancipate or therefore to marry in the state of Virginia. There's an attorney appointed to the minor. There's an inquiry into what would be in the minor's best interest, and there's an investigation of the criminal record and protective order history between the two parties to the marriage. And the impact of this new law that passed in 2016 was immediate, and it was really important. I mentioned on a previous slide, the year before this law passed, there were 182 children married in Virginia. The year after it passed, that number plummeted down to 13. Now, you'll hear me say this over and over, 13 is not 0. 13 minors married is 13 too many. But an 87% decrease is a really important difference, and that made an important difference to over 100 children who might otherwise have been married in the state of Virginia in 2017 and in every year since then. So with the Virginia campaign done, we moved on to another state where Tahirih has an office. Shout out to anyone located in the Houston area. You might be familiar with our office there. And we launched a campaign in Texas in 2017. So again, to give you a picture of what was going on in Texas at the time, the state had no absolute minimum marriage age. There was no age floor. Older minors, age 16 and 17, were able to marry with just a parent's consent. And again, I've hammered over and over, I'm going to say it again. Parental consent exception, often just mass parental coercion. What you're doing here is enabling the most common perpetrators of a forced child marriage to force their own children into marriage. And under age 16, there was a judicial approval process in place, but it was one of those sort of rubber stamp processes that I've talked about. There wasn't any real investigation into potential coercion or abuse that might be happening in the case. And evidence of that is, since 2000, there were children as young as age 12 and 13 being married in the state of Texas. So this obviously is not a super protective judicial approval process that they had in place at the time. Given Texas's large population and these very permissive laws, the state was really the epicenter of child marriage in the United States. There was a great report done by Frontline back in 2017. It's actually still online today if anyone wants to pull it up afterwards. And they looked at the data across every state where it was available to see to what degree child marriage was happening in each state. And they found that Texas was far and away the leader. There were, over the period they studied, 2000 to 2014, there were over 40,000 children married in Texas. In terms of per capita rate, Texas was, I believe, the fourth highest. And so it's not just a factor of population that was making them the #1 state for child marriage. They were also seeing children married at a much higher per capita rate as well. And because of that, it made Texas a really important target for reforms that could maximize the impact to limit and end child marriage in the United States. So a quick overview of the political dynamics in Texas at the time, not too different from today. It was a Republican trifecta with Republicans controlling both houses of the legislature and a Republican in the governor's office. The way this played out was actually a little bit different from Virginia in that the eventual Republican sponsor of this legislation had seen reporting on the issue and had seen reporting on Virginia passing a law, and he contacted Tahirih and he said, "Hey, I want to work on this. Can you help?" And so our policy team and our Houston office jumped into action. We were super excited at that opportunity. And we worked with not only the Republican sponsor, but an eventual Democratic co-sponsor as well. Again, that bipartisan co-sponsorship was really important. We worked as hard as we could to try and get Texas to be the first state that ended child marriage. It quickly became apparent that despite a lot of relationship building and a lot of advocacy with legislators and with advocacy partners in the state, Texas was not going to go 18 no exceptions that year, and there wasn't a likely path to get them to go 18 no exceptions in the near future either. And an important thing to keep in mind here is that Texas's legislature actually only meets every 2 years. And so we knew that if something didn't pass in 2017, we weren't even getting another shot until 2019. And so that added to the sort of urgency of getting something done. When it became clear that ending child marriage in the state was not possible, we had a lot of conversations internally with our partners, with survivor advocates that we were working with, both in the state and elsewhere, about what we should do. Given the urgency of a legislature that only meets every 2 years and the urgency of working in the state that is the epicenter of child marriage in the United States. And what we knew and what we decided was that we couldn't walk away with nothing. We needed to pass the best reform we could at the time to at least mitigate the harm as much as possible while continuing to still push Texas towards age 18. And so the result of that was, again, similar to what we saw in Virginia. It was a reform that limited marriage to legal adults. Same as in Virginia, the emancipation process in Texas is eligible or is open to folks who are age 16 or older. So functionally, there is an age 16 floor in addition to that emancipation requirement. And that emancipation process appoints an attorney to the minor, and there's a best interest inquiry. Again, these are some similar things to what we saw in the eventual Virginia reform. A second really important component of the reform in Texas was that it defined forced marriage as a form of child abuse. And this was really important because what that did was make it very clear to CPS in the state that cases of forced child marriage fall within their mandate for child protection. And it made it clear that a child facing forced marriage can seek a protection order in the state of Texas. That's something that, to our knowledge, Texas is the only state to have done at this point. We want to see that expanded to include adults in Texas, and we want to see it expanded beyond Texas to make sure that people facing forced marriage, adults and children, have access to protection orders across the United States. So the impact of this law, it was even greater than what we saw in Virginia. A year after the law went into place, there was a 95% decline in the number of children being married in Texas. That's held true over a number of years since that. We keep checking back. We want to make sure it wasn't just a blip in the radar, but the numbers have stayed that low since then as well. And so what that means is while Texas, again, similar to Virginia, fell far short of ending child marriage, there was a huge impact. And that law has prevented hundreds of child marriages that would have otherwise happened every single year since it's been in place. Now, finally, I get to my favorite state, Delaware, because it is not only is their nickname the first state, they were also the first state to end child marriage. And that happened in 2018. And this campaign played out a bit differently for Tahirih, whereas in Virginia, we kind of started the campaign and built it from the ground up. And in Texas, we were invited in by a legislator to a state where, of course, we already had an office and already had connections. In Delaware, we were really joining an existing fight. There was already an in-state movement that was working to end child marriage in Delaware and had been doing so for about a decade. back in 2008, there was a legislative push initiated by court officers. So essentially the clerks, again, who are responsible for issuing these marriage licenses, they were tired of issuing marriage licenses to children, knowing that that kid was going to go home and face harm, but having no actual power to prevent the marriage from happening. And so they pushed within their own state and with their allies in the state for a reform in 2008 that created one of these universal judicial review processes. And so since 2008, every single minor who married in the state of Delaware was at least having to go before a judge. Again, not perfect, not the gold standard we're shooting for, but definitely a step in the right direction. And it's something that makes Delaware sort of an early mover, even pre-2016. Because of this previous campaign, the conversation around child marriage was already happening in Delaware. It was something that legislators were familiar with. It was something advocates in the state were familiar with. There was support for ending child marriage from the State Domestic Violence Coalition, from the Office of Women's Advancement, et cetera. So unlike in Virginia, where we were really starting from square one, explaining what child marriage even is and the fact that it's happening, people in Delaware knew what was going on. And that made the reform easier. This previous reform also had an important impact in removing the sort of constituency for child marriage. And I'm putting constituency here in heavy air quotes. But in states like Texas previously, or like Virginia, that are seeing a lot of people married underage, when you go to a legislator and show them those numbers, while that displays the impact of the problem and the scale of the problem in that state, it might also trigger a thought for them like, oh, okay, well, 182 children married in Virginia last year. That's going to be 182 people that might be mad at me if I pass a law that bans child marriage going forward. And so by having a previous reform in place in Delaware, it sort of removed that as a nagging thought in the back of legislators' minds, which I think was important. So what did the law actually say when this campaign sort of relaunched in Delaware? In 2017, despite the previous reform, Delaware still was one of the states with no age floor, but they did have that universal judicial review that I mentioned. And this wasn't just a rubber stamp. There was a bit of guidance put in place for the judges. It wasn't great, but it wasn't nothing either. And the result of that was that post-2008, there were very few minors marrying in Delaware. There were only 4 children married in 2011. There was only 1 married in 2012. I'll say again and again, 1 child married is 1 too many, but it's not a problem of the same scope that you're seeing in somewhere like Virginia or especially Texas. So in Delaware, again, the campaign had bipartisan sponsors. The political dynamic here is a bit different from other states what we've talked about, where as we had a sort of split power in Virginia and a Republican trifecta in Texas, there was a Democrat trifecta in Delaware, although you can see the Senate here was split quite closely. And so it was really important to get sponsors from both political parties politically, and particularly in the Senate. And again, there was an existing movement, not only in Delaware, but at this point, 2018, we're 2 years out from that reform in Virginia. We saw that a reform passed in Texas in 2017. 2017 also saw reforms pass in New York and Kentucky. And in 2018, there were bills to end child marriage pending in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Louisiana. So at this point, child marriage is starting to become more of a mainstream issue across the country, and especially in Delaware. It is already a pretty mainstream issue at the time, at least relative to the other states that we've talked about. Like I said, this was a new role for Tahirih. We were sort of supporting an existing movement rather than leading it ourselves. That is particularly important in somewhere like Delaware where we don't have an office. It's hard to lead a campaign where you don't have staff on the ground. So, we were still doing lobbying. We were talking to legislators. We were calling folks. We were sending testimony, but we weren't leading the movement in the same way that we had in other states. We provided some coordination, and we especially provided technical assistance. So at this point, we've written reports about the different ways that laws can allow harmful child marriages to go forward. We've gathered research. We have talking points that we've used in other states. And so we're providing all of that to our partners in Delaware, both legislative sponsors, but also advocates on the ground. And one example of how this made an impact in Delaware was a conversation that happened around military exceptions in the state. So this is actually, at this point, we're now early in my career at Tahirih. I joined Tahirih in 2017, and so I'm still kind of getting acclimated and finding myself as an advocate. And I was talking to staff in the office of Representative Kim Williams, who was the Democratic sponsor of this bill to end child marriage. And they were really concerned because in a committee hearing in the House, there had been a lot of questions about wanting to include a military exception in this bill. And so essentially what that would mean is setting an age floor of 18 for civilians, but allowing active duty military people military service members to either marry someone who is underage, or if they themselves are underage, and in the US you can enlist at age 17, allowing them to marry. This is not an uncommon question among legislators, and it's something that we'd encountered before. And so when they reached out to me saying, hey, we're really concerned, we're expecting a big floor debate about this very issue, I had talking points ready. I had research that my colleagues had already done. And I was able to, in the same afternoon, turn that around to the legislator staff, and they were able to utilize that in the floor debate that played out later that same week. And the representative was able to fend off efforts to amend the bill and to introduce a military exception. So that bill was able to move forward as age 18, no exceptions. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about New York, which is, again, a bit of a different dynamic in that New York was the first state to end child marriage, but to do it in two separate sort of incremental steps. There were campaigns in the state that succeeded in passing laws in 2017, which limited child marriage, and then in 2021 finally ended it entirely. So going back to the 2017 campaign, the state of play in 2016 was somewhat similar to what we've seen elsewhere. The state did have an age floor. It was at age 14, so pretty low, but it did have some absolute floor, which is relatively good compared to other states. Older minors, age 16 and 17, were able to marry with nothing more than parental consent, and younger minors needed judicial approval. So 14 and 15-year-olds needed a judge to sign off. Again, this is a large population state. These are pretty permissive rules. It resulted in thousands of marriages happening. In the decade from 2000 to 2010, there were nearly 4,000 children married in the state of New York. So the first campaign here in 2017, this again, we had bipartisan bill sponsors. There was also broad in-state support from organizations within New York. So those of you in the advocacy community, I'm sure, are aware there are a large number of advocacy organizations based, especially in New York City, not only working on issues like child marriage, but on a lot of related issues, and working at the local and state and national and international level. And so there's really a huge advocacy community in New York that was really helpful in pushing this campaign here. And the result of that 2017 campaign was, again, following the same pattern that other states before, Texas, Kentucky, Virginia, had followed, and limiting marriage to legal adults, so age 18 or a minor who's been emancipated. New York did go a bit further, and they actually set a firm age floor within that of 17, and so you had to be emancipated and also 17 years old in order to marry in New York. But it did still have that emancipation exception. And the process here, again, looked pretty similar to what we'd seen previously. There's an attorney appointed to the minor, a best interest inquiry, a criminal record review. And you'll see here this in-chamber interview is another protection that was built into this law. And that's a result of advocates kind of learning over time how to make these judicial processes more protective. And so when I say an in-chamber interview, what that looks like is as part of their evaluation of whether to approve the marriage of a minor, the judge holds an interview with just that minor, no parents present, no prospective spouse present, and has an interview with them to talk about the marriage and whether they want it, and trying to suss out whether there might be coercion or abuse at play here. And that gives the minor an admittedly imperfect opportunity to disclose any abuse or any coercion that might be playing out. And it also, even if the minor doesn't disclose directly, it gives the judge at least an opportunity to try and suss out whether there's coercion at play here. So after the law passed in 2017, advocates in New York were not satisfied, and I think correctly so. None of us are satisfied with anything that falls short of ending child marriage entirely. And I particularly want to shout out a survivor advocate based in New York named Naila Amin, who really did not take a break after 2017. She kept meeting with legislators. She kept showing up in their offices. She kept saying, this is not enough. New York needs to end child marriage. Because largely of her hard work, though of course supported by other advocates and others in New York, and including national organizations like Tahirih, there were age 18 bills introduced almost immediately afterwards. There was one in 2019, and then there was one in 2021, and finally that 2021 bill succeeded, got New York over the finish line, and made it another state that had ended child marriage, and the first state to end child marriage in a sort of with a sort of incremental approach. That 2021 law is, I think, appropriately referred to as Naila's Law. And while New York was the first state to successfully take this incremental approach to ending child marriage, we're really hopeful that it won't be the last. And we actually know, as of this year, that it isn't. Connecticut similarly passed a reform in 2017 that limited but did not end child marriage, and then followed that up this year in 2023, thanks to continued advocacy, and became, I believe they were the 9th state to end child marriage, ahead of Michigan becoming the 10th later that year. So I'll talk a little bit now about the impact of the national campaign and the lessons that Tahirih has learned through advocating in not only these 34 states that have passed a law, but in some of the states that still have not passed any reform. I think the most obvious impact are the changed laws. As I've talked about a number of times, 34 states have passed a reform since 2016. 10 of those ended child marriage entirely, and 24 more limited child marriage in one way or another. We're hopeful that all 24 of those will follow after New York and Connecticut and finish the job by ending child marriage soon. There is also the important awareness that gets raised anytime a campaign is run. So child marriage in the US was not something that was commonly discussed really prior to the 2010s, and especially that 2016 campaign, but it's now really commonly covered by not only domestic media, from local newspapers to broadcast news on CNN or Fox News, but also by international press as well. And there are some interesting examples of these international stories about child marriage in the US actually then feeding back into those other countries re-examining their own laws. The BBC has covered child marriage in the United States a number of times, and just recently England and Wales ended child marriage. And so we really are part of an international network of advocates that are fighting to end child marriage in their own countries. Another really important impact of this awareness is that legislators know about the issue. So when we started the campaign, and I talked about this in Virginia, we had to start from square one, just explaining what child marriage is, showing them the statute, showing them that it was allowed in their state, and showing them the data that proved it was happening, especially having them talk to survivors who had experienced it. That is not so much the case anymore. Usually now when we're starting a campaign in the state, we don't need to start from square one. And I think a really important element of that is when you look at this map here, you'll notice that while there are still states that have not passed a reform, there's no state that is completely isolated from reform either. Every single state in the US either has passed a reform themselves or has at least one neighboring state that has passed a reform. The only exception here is Hawaii, but I'm including them in this because they've introduced bills several times, and they don't border any other states, but they are also aware of and working on the issue. And that's really important because state legislators learn from each other. They see what neighboring states are doing. They see what like-minded states are doing. And when they see progress happening in other states, especially their neighbors, they don't want their own state to fall behind. The awareness among legislators has also led to legislators who are independently starting these campaigns on their own, maybe without even talking to Tahirih. I talked about the sponsor in Texas who reached out to us. That's now very common, thanks to this increased media coverage that was generated by other campaigns. It's also pretty common for us to reach out to a legislator who has seen the issue, read about a campaign in another state, and then just looked at their own statute, said, I can pretty easily write a bill to end child marriage here. I just cross out 16 and write 18, and that's that. So it's a pretty common dynamic now for these bills to be introduced, and then for us to find out about them and call up that legislator and advocates in the state and say, like, hey, super excited that you're doing this. How can we help? Here's our reports. Here's our expertise. Here's what we've learned, etc. The issue really has become mainstream in a way that was not at all true back in 2015. These campaigns also go hand in hand with trainings for service providers, and we often see more calls for service during and after a public policy campaign gets run in a state. When a statewide conversation around gender-based violence includes child marriage as a type of gender-based violence, we're able to more easily connect with the coalitions and service providers in that state, training them on both child and forced marriage in general, and making them better able to provide services to people within their own state, or to contact us if they have questions and need technical assistance on those cases. The attention generated from these campaigns leads to more call for service, not only from individuals facing forced marriage, but also from those service providers. Campaigns, even when they don't succeed in passing a law, can also have a normative impact. The media coverage that goes along with introducing a piece of legislation and having it move through the legislature draws attention to the issue. That can help survivors feel more comfortable coming forward and sharing their stories or seeking services. Attention for a bill legitimizes the fact that forced child marriage is a real problem. It is happening in the United States, and it's an issue that deserves attention and that deserves solving. Even very tepid reforms have had outsized impacts compared to what the reform actually did on paper. I think a good example of this is I looked at data from the state of Missouri that passed a very basic reform. I think they tinkered with their age floor and bumped it up a couple years, but they weren't seeing many 14-year-olds marrying. So when they set an age floor at 16, that shouldn't have led to a huge decrease in child marriage. Don't get me wrong, the decrease wasn't huge, but it was a lot more than just preventing 2 or 3 14-year-olds from marrying earlier. And the explanation for this is likely something along the lines of media and the legislators in that state are talking about child marriage. They're talking about the harms of child marriage. They're talking about the impact that it has on survivors and communities. And people see that and they maybe think again about whether or not they want their own child to be married underage. And finally, a huge impact of this movement has been the growth of a survivor-led movement. I've mentioned a couple times the huge role that survivor advocates have played in every single state where Tahirih's run a campaign or where campaigns have sort of gotten off the ground on their own. And there's now a national network of survivor advocates who are actively coordinating with one another to support bills ending child marriage in their own states, in their neighboring states, in the states where they were married, and in the states that have similar laws. They are actively out here talking to the media, talking to legislators, helping to write legislation and amendments, and really pushing this movement forward. And so I really want to sort of give the flowers where they're deserved to the survivor advocates who are leading this movement. Tahirih tries to help with this as best we can by fostering and supporting that network of survivor advocates. We can do things with my 40 hours a week that someone who is doing this on top of another job and a busy life are not able to do. So I support that network by doing things like tracking bills and giving updates in that way, providing technical assistance or training or access, obviously, to Tahirih's reports that are online, making media connections, things like that. And that's not because these survivor advocates are incapable of doing it on their own. Again, it's simply a matter of I get paid to do that work for 40 hours a week, and so I can do sort of that administrative grunt work that takes a lot of time, and that if every individual working on this issue has to do it independently, the movement would really grind down under the weight of that administrative review. So I'm happy to support the network of survivor advocates who are out there in that way. So in running our campaigns across 34 states, we've also learned a lot about how to run a campaign and what elements of it are important. And you'll see here, I've noted this as 34 plus states because we work on a lot of campaigns that are not successful in passing any legislation. I mentioned a lot of these gray and red states have introduced bills that have not yet gotten across the finish line, but that doesn't mean we're not active there as well. And so we're able to learn from the wins, but also from the losses or the not yet wins anyway. One of the things that we've really come away with are the foundations that make for a successful campaign, sort of building blocks that if you don't have these in place, you're going to face an uphill battle. The first one of these is having statewide data. I talked about how easy that was to access in Virginia, and I talked about how other states make it not so easy or even make it impossible to obtain. There are still states in the US that don't gather data on a statewide level at all. There's also the importance of local coalitions led by local advocates who know their own legislatures very well, who know the political dynamics in the state. And then, of course, there's the survivor advocacy and survivor leadership that's hugely important. We've also learned a lot about the different forms our own advocacy can take: lobbying and coalition building, education and technical assistance, both for service providers and for public policy advocates in the state. We conduct a lot of research, do a lot of media outreach, put our resources online. I mentioned a story. This actually happened in, I believe it was Wyoming. There was an advocate who I had never spoken with, to my knowledge, had never contacted Tahirih, but when she sat down to testify on a bill in supporting limiting child marriage in the state, she pulled out a Tahirih report and was reading facts from that report. So making those resources publicly available is really important to us as well. And then we've also learned just how much states are watching their neighbors. Every state is unique, but all states have a lot in common. And one of the things they have in common is that they're all watching each other. Legislator in Maryland is generally going to keep a close eye on what's happening in somewhere like Delaware, Pennsylvania, or Virginia. And the same is true, in Oklahoma. They're looking to Texas, they're looking to Missouri, just to see what's going on in among their peer states. And so that introduces some really strong messaging opportunities of just talking about what's happening in neighboring states, where a state's falling behind. You'll notice on, maybe you can't see it here, but if you zoom in on DC, it's the sort of last little gray blip in the mid-Atlantic that hasn't passed a reform yet. And so that's a messaging point that we're really talking about a lot in DC, that they're becoming a sort of regional hub for child marriage. And then finally, we've learned that the impacts of legislation crosses state lines. Just as easily as I can drive up 95 to visit family in Rhode Island or drive down 95 to go to the beach in North Carolina, someone who wants to marry off a child can also do that same thing and cross state borders easily. And so we've seen in a number of states that when one state passes a strong law to limit or end child marriage, minors who reside in that state will be taken to the next state over. And for that reason, it's really important for minors in, say, Michigan. It's important that Michigan ended child marriage. It is also very important that Wisconsin ends child marriage. And so we will not end child marriage in any state until we have ended child marriage in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. Lastly, we've learned a lot about the balance you have to play when you're talking about compromise and incrementalism. While 10 states have ended child marriage, there are 24 more that have limited it, but fallen short of ending it. And those 24 states have taken a wide variety of approaches and had a wide variety of impacts. One of the best of these is Georgia, that passed a very similar law to what we talked about in Texas and Virginia and 2017 in New York, where they have a very protective judicial process. They're requiring emancipation prior to marriage. And the impact of that law is a 96% decline in child marriages in Georgia. Again, not 100%, but that's way more impressive than Maine, where they passed a reform back in, I believe it was 2020, that set a minimum marriage age of 16, didn't really tinker at all with the approval process. It's a lower population state. It had a pretty low rate of child marriage in the first place. And so the impact of this reform was basically nothing. They actually saw one additional child marriage the following year. So while it's important that they ruled out the worst case scenario of a very young minor marrying, that incremental reform cannot be held in the same conversation as somewhere like Georgia that is seeing large declines. And again, regardless of how strong the compromise is, no compromise is as strong as ending child marriage entirely. And so that is always our goal. We've learned that the more sort of protective bells and whistles you add, the more you're going to get out of it. The protective judicial review processes with things like a separate interview, emancipation, background checks, those are really important. We've also found that for states that won't involve the judiciary for a variety of political reasons, one important thing that they can do is limiting the age difference between parties. If you're setting a very tight age difference limitation, I'm thinking here of Florida, which I believe limits partners to no more than 2 years older than one another when a minor is marrying, that can also have a significant impact on decreasing the overall numbers of child marriage, even while falling short of doing any individual case-by-case analysis. And I think the best sort of case example of the impact that a compromise law can have and when it might be important to compromise instead of holding out for 18 is by comparing Texas and Delaware, which I talked about a bit earlier. So in Texas, we knew that there were hundreds of children marrying every year. And so when age 18 was off the table, it was important to us to decrease the amount of harm that was happening in that state when we had the opportunity to do so. And that reform has prevented hundreds of child marriages from happening in the state every single year that it's been in place. And at the same time, we are still pushing to end child marriage entirely in Texas. There were bills introduced in 2021 and 2023 that aimed to end child marriage. They didn't go anywhere, but rest assured, we are still pushing. Compare that to a state like Delaware, where they were seeing 1 or 2 children marrying every year and where the legislature meets annually. In that state, if it had become clear in 2018 that age 18, no exceptions, wasn't going to happen that year, you're not really enabling that much harm by holding out and trying to get to age 18 the next year. There might be 1 or 2 children who marry in the interim, but that's very different from hundreds who would marry in Texas had we tried to hold out in that case. So what's next? The obvious answer is we ended child marriage in 10 states with the help of all of our partners across the country. That leaves 40 states. So we are 20% of the way there. We have a lot of work left ahead of us. With all that work on the table, obviously we have to prioritize. Tahirih's priority right now is ending child marriage in Washington, D.C. We've launched a campaign there with some local partners at the Person Center and D.C. Rape Crisis Center and a few others. The reason we're targeting D.C. is basically, I mentioned it's sort of the last blip in the mid-Atlantic that hasn't passed any reform. It's also the last of the states where Tahirih has a direct service area, has an office, but that hasn't passed a reform. And so that's why we're focused here. The other places to focus will be on the worst offender states. So those states left with no age floor, the states that still have a pregnancy exception, and particularly the states that still have high numbers of child marriages happening. And finally, we know that adjusting minimum marriage ages isn't the only way that we need to be going about ending child marriage, and especially forced marriage that includes adults as well. We also want to advocate for the creation of forced marriage protection orders, similar to what I talked about in Texas. There's also a role for the federal government here. While I mentioned the Congress can't set a minimum marriage age, domestically across the states, our immigration law still allows child marriages to happen through our immigration system. And so that is a role that Congress can play, and that's something that we're working on right now. Of course, we also offer direct services. If anyone here is serving cases and thinks they might encounter a case of forced or child marriage, reach out to us directly, fmi@tahirih.org. And finally, we provide training and education like what I'm doing here today that's available to direct service providers. It's available to public policy advocates, survivor advocates, whoever. If you want to learn more, again, please do reach out. And with that, I believe